Hi there. In this video, I'll be talking about natural selection, which was one of the main portions of Darwin's famous Origin of the Species book. Before he actually started talking about natural selection, his first chapter was on artificial selection, that is, variation under domestication. Then he related this to variation under nature, that is, natural selection, starting in chapter 2. Darwin was an observer, a very good observer, and he had noted all of the artificial selection that farmers usually practiced. First for dog breeding, bird breeding, and then plant breeding as well. People were breeding for characters that were desirable and or useful. For example, artificial selection in maize has led to a modern modern maize, that has large kernels and large cobs with the kernels. But the ancient corn, the original corn or maize, was much simpler and had fewer kernels on each floral head. So by selective breeding, humans have created modern maize, which needs humans in order to reproduce. It can't reproduce on its own any longer because of the formation of the large cobs, which really don't release the kernels or seeds. And this domestication of maize began thousands of years ago, resulting in a large number of different varieties of maize now, including popcorn, feed corn, sweet corn, etc. Humans have also been breeding cats for probably at least 9,000 to 11,000 years. And so now we have a huge number of varieties of cats, depending on the desirable characters that people were looking for. So there's all the way over to the Russian Blue and a Siamese down here, and other breeds of cats also. Darwin pointed out in his book that originally these original species of cats and the original species of maize, etc., the original ones that were first bred, had characters in them already, this genetic variation, and that when they would cross them in different ways, they would get new variants, and so then they would select for those variants, but this was done by humans, but the overall basic material was natural. He also discussed dog breeds in the genus Canis, and so there are a huge number, over 300 recognized varieties of dogs in the world today. And the first domestication of dogs came that were wolves, probably predated about 11,000 to 12,000 years ago. In addition to the large number of varieties of dogs, there also are other species of within the genus Canis, including coyotes, red wolves, gray wolves, dingoes, and jackals, some jackals, that can breed also with dogs and between them, each one of those different species, to form viable progeny that can also reproduce. So there's a lot of variation there, but there's also a lot of commonality within the entire genus. There are two other species down here, the black-backed jackal and the side-striped jackal, which live on a different continent, and they've been separated for a longer period of time, and so they can interbreed between themselves, but they can't interbreed with the others, primarily because the chromosome number has changed. But in general, there's a lot of variation that exists within this genus, and so selection for certain characters is very possible, and probably one reason why dogs were domesticated. This is a phylogenetic tree of some of those species, including gray wolf, and dogs would be up here also, with a chromosome number of 39. So they can actually all interbreed, and there's quite a bit of difference between them. So they've speciated based on the characters that worked for them under natural selection. And then, of course, the dogs by artificial selection. And then there's the black-backed jackal and the side-striped jackal that have a chromosome number of 37. So although they also have some of that variation, there's been a change in the chromosome number, mainly by fusing of some of the chromosomes. And so they can't breed with the others, even though they are fairly closely related to the others. So within the genus Canis, both for dogs and all of the other species within that genus, there's been some artificial selection, such as in dogs, but then a lot of natural selection in the other natural species. And so you can see there's sort of a crossover, or at least a joining, and this was a joining that Darwin recognized within this thing that we call selection. So if you look at beak size, and that was one of the things that Darwin studied in the finches on the Galapagos, before selection, here's the average beak size, but after selection, only the birds with the longer beaks are selected, and so the average beak size goes up. If the beak size then is heritable, then you get organisms, birds with the long beaks. But if it's not heritable, then you just get the general average beak size in the original population. The beak size we know now is related to the type of food that the birds eat, and whether it's a dry year, which produces harder seeds, or a wet year, which produces more pliable seeds. So you need a larger beak during dry periods, and that's what Darwin found, that there were these birds with the larger beaks, and so they were selected for. The ones with the smaller beaks couldn't get enough to eat because they couldn't break the seeds open. And then that longer beak became heritable, and so all the birds after that had a larger beak. But there was always variation. So some birds had a slightly smaller beak, so you could move back and forth within a dozen years or so, going from a larger beak to a smaller beak as an average size. Natural selection is not forward-looking, so there's no predetermined goal. There are just variations on a theme, essentially, and then those different mutations, different changes are selected by environmental changes. And so that the environmental change leads to those organisms that have those characters to survive, and that's how different characters sort of emerge from all of the variation within a species or population. So new traits evolve through natural selection of existing traits. So you don't come up with a brand new morphological character out of the blue. It's actually based on variation of a previous character that was there. And one of the things that's also noticed is that this mutation and selection are not perfect. So that is, if you were to design a particular portion of the body, you might design it very differently than what evolution and selection have come up with. And one of those examples is the panda's thumb, which really isn't a thumb, but it's an extension of an already existing bone, one of the metatarsals in the hand or in the paw, that helps it grab onto things. But it's not morphologically or evolutionarily related to our thumb. It's a new appendage from a different bone. So natural selection does not lead to a perfect organism. Populations face many contradictory patterns of selection through time. So what works at one time might be a detriment at a different time. One thing that Darwin pointed out was the peacock's tail, right? So the peacock's tail will attract not only mates, but it'll also make the male more visible to predators. And many birds have this, where they have bright coloration, so they are more prone to being attacked by the predators than the females, which usually have a more drab color. So that doesn't seem like a perfect solution. So while the males are more attractive to the females, and so they mate, they're also more prone to being eaten by a predator. And so if there are more predators around, then the males would be much more vulnerable to attack by these predators. Natural selection also does not create anything new, anything brand new. It tinkers essentially with pre-existing body forms, and then those eventually become established, such as the human eye. It's the result of a long line of visual and light reactive cells all the way back to very, very simple organisms. And remember, I talked about the bacterial flagellum, also very complex, but that came out of a very much different and simpler system. So all of those parts already existed. Evolution just had to act on selecting the genes or sets of genes that properly function for that particular environment. Here's another example of a poor design. You wouldn't design a lever like the arm, but it is evolved that way because it's functional as an arm. And this would be analogous to legs also, and in animals as well. So a lever works like this, where you need the fulcrum close to the load, and then a long extension for the force, so you can get a small force down here will exert a larger force down here. But if you look at the elbow joint down here, then the fulcrum is very close to where the force is applied. So if it were a better lever, then this muscle would be attached further out, but it's not. So although it works, it's not a perfect design, at least from a physics standpoint. In addition to the arm and elbow and human eye, there are also other structures that indicate evolution is occurring, and it's not always perfect. One is vestigial structures. So these are derived from common ancestors, such as a pelvis in snakes and the human appendix and the tailbone and wisdom teeth, that at one time were useful in the ancestors of all of these organisms, but are no longer useful, but those structures are still there because they're a part of the developmental processes that evolved in the ancestors. Also, if evolution was perfect, there wouldn't be fatal errors that occur occasionally. So ectopic pregnancies are one of these, where the fertilized egg implants in the fallopian tube rather than the uterus, which can be life-threatening. Also, development of testes in men, first in the abdomen, and then they migrate to the scrotum, which becomes a weak area where hernias can form. And then the human pharynx, which is used both for ingestion of food and respiration, so it represents a choking risk, which actually happens quite often. So if you were to design something, then these systems would have been designed in a much different way, but they also indicate an evolutionary history for each one of those systems. Natural selection is definitely not random, so there's a non-random superiority in survival and reproductive success of organisms with some variance over others, so that this is definitely not a random process. And in contrast, mutation and recombination are processes that are random or nearly random. I happen to work on molecular aspects of this, and they're not completely random events. Still under debate is what level of action is natural selection, or what's the unit of natural selection? Is it at the level of the gene, individual, group, species? And I've already spoken about this in a previous video, and I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of this one. So, with the modern synthesis of evolution started by Fisher in the 1930s, that is, so now they knew that there were genes and mutation, whereas Darwin didn't know anything about genes. They were not known at that time. But the first postulate of Darwin is that variation in individuals within a population is the result of mutation to create new alleles, and segregation and independent assortment, or shuffling of the alleles into new combinations. The second one is that individuals pass these alleles on to their offspring. That is, there's inheritance of those alleles. And then in every generation, some individuals are more successful at surviving and reproducing than others. And then finally, the individuals that survive and reproduce, or who reproduce the most, are those with the allele and allelic combinations that best adapt them to their environments. So the alleles and combinations associated with higher fitness increase in frequency from one generation to the next, so the species evolve. So much of this modern synthesis was the product of some work by Fisher, Haldane, and Wright, who were population geneticists. And so they were looking at these characters within populations and discovered then that mutation and natural selection are the cause of adaptive evolution. And then another part of then looking at evolution in a modern sense were Dobzhansky and Meyer then proposed that macroevolution, that is speciation and above, was caused by the same events as in microevolution, that is leading to species and speciation. Furthermore, in 1973, Dobzhansky stated that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, which essentially criticized the anti-evolution creationism thoughts, which have recently been updated into something called intelligent design. So he would be criticizing that as well. From the 1950s to now, the emphasis has been on genetics and molecular biology, molecular evolution. And then in the 70s and 80s, Moto Kimura started some experiments which showed that there was a neutral theory of evolution. That is, that not everything is based on natural selection, and in fact, most characters have no selection on them at all, so that natural selection was only operating on a few different characters at a time. So in this little cartoon here, you have these two deer that look essentially the same. So in most cases, many of the characters that they exhibit are not the product of natural selection, just a few are. And then occasionally a character will come up that will be either advantageous or disadvantageous in the survival and reproduction of those organisms. And in one of the examples that is most often used is giraffe evolution. According to Darwin, then, you have giraffes with different neck sizes, and only the ones that can reach the branches eventually will survive long enough to reproduce. And so that's just natural selection. However, another part of this is that to have longer necks, they had to also have stronger hearts, more resilient blood vessels, and then when they leaned down to drink water, it was kind of awkward. They had to spread their legs out, and they also had to have special valves in their arteries so that their blood vessels didn't burst as they lowered their heads to drink water. So quite a few things had to happen, some of which were advantageous and some of which were not as advantageous to survive, to reproduce. And then here's another example that's used quite a bit with the peppered moth example in England during the Industrial Revolution. So prior to industrialization, the moths were modeled black and white. And so when they landed on the lichens on the trees, then they were pretty much invisible to predators. However, there was variation in the coloration so that occasionally a black moth would arise, and those were quickly picked off by the birds who ate them, or other predators that ate them, so that mainly the peppered type, the typical type, predominated during that time, and the black type was just a mutant that was quickly found and devoured. However, during the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of soot on the trees from the industry pouring out all sorts of black carbon smoke. And so now the typical form, which was a modeled black and white, showed up more clearly on the tree trunks, and the black type, the black mutant, was not seen as well by the predators. And so the distribution of black moths versus the modeled typical type changed dramatically, so that the black type were more common than the modeled normal type. So this just shows that the original population was predominantly the speckled black and white typical type, and later, after industrialization, the more typical type was the black type, and the modeled type were found less frequently, indicating natural selection. So again, both characters were present in both populations. So the characters were there, and it was the environmental conditions that selected the most successful morphology. And here's another example, which comes from a number of experiments where a population of mice that's moved into a new area, where it's a mixed population, some are black and some are tan. The tan mice are more visible, so they're found more often by the predators. And then eventually the population becomes more and more the black mice and fewer of the tan mice. So the predators also have to adjust to this change, so they may choose to eat a different organism based on the ease of finding it. So ultimately the raw materials of selection are these. First, there's mutation. There have to be heritable changes in the genetic material. If there were no mutation, there would be no evolution or selection. And then the alleles, versions of the genes. So 4 alleles for gene A, 6 alleles for gene B, etc. Which ones are being expressed at the time, and which ones ultimately become the most successful. And then there's mixing of the genes and alleles during meiosis and mitosis, and sexual reproduction also causes mixing of these various alleles. Sometimes there are good mixes and sometimes there are bad mixes with respect to selection. And then there are interactions, influences of versions of proteins with versions of other proteins. Do they interact successfully, unsuccessfully? Are they antagonistic reactions as well? So a lot of different things are occurring within and exterior to the organism that lead to these different selective pressures. So in total then, if you have this original organism, mutation creates some variation in the progeny, and then unfavorable mutations are selected against. You have these also reproducing, creating more variation due to mutation, and then more selection, and eventually leading to a different population that has usually different allele proportions, and on and on and on. So all of these changes then lead to variation within the population. And then selection leads to survival of some of those individuals that are best suited for the extant environments. Now, at a later time, selection might act in a different way because the environmental conditions are different. So it all depends, the luck of the draw that you get when you have certain mutations, certain alleles, are they good at this particular time, or would they have been better 50 years ago or 100 years from now? Here's an example that I think I showed in a previous video, where in dry years, the finches on the Galapagos Islands, are the ones with the large beaks are favored because the seeds are harder and drier. Whereas in wet years, the birds, the finches with narrower, sharper beaks are favored because they have softer seeds, as well as some will eat insects as well. And so you can see how this changes from year to year, where one beak style is favored over another. So you constantly have this variation existing in the population, and then selection leading to one beak size or another that are favored in those particular environments. So if you start up here with same beak sizes in all of the finches, and then there's an environmental change where there's a drought where the seeds become harder and there are fewer soft seeds, then birds with more robust beaks are favored. And so within the variation within the population, those with the more robust beaks survive. Those with the smaller beaks do not survive. So that during different times when the stressors in the environment change, then you will see a change in beak size. And this has actually been found in the Galapagos Islands over a period of less than 100 years. You can see these changes happening. In fact, you can see them changing over a few years, and then some of these changes will last, will permanently change certain populations of the birds on the Galapagos Islands and elsewhere. Here I use you as an example of selection. So human males produce approximately 500 billion sperm in their lifetime, of which about 50 to 60% are viable. Human females release approximately 400 eggs in their lifetimes, of which approximately 40 to 50% are viable. The chances of an individual sperm fertilizing an individual egg is about 1 in 50 trillion. However, about 20% or more of pregnancies end in miscarriages. So therefore, there has been a great deal of heavy selection that was occurring to produce only the most viable offspring, including you. So in essence, your chances of being born were less than 1 in a million. There were more like 1 in 50 trillion or more. So you are very lucky. Finally, I wanted to show this figure one more time. I showed it in a previous video. But in this video, I have been talking about this extra-organismal level of environmental selection, this environmental filter, to lead to an advantageous function. But recall, I was talking that there are all these other filters back here that lead to selection in one way or another, leading to mutations, altered RNAs, altered splicing, all the way down to forming a functional protein or a non-functional protein. So there are many levels of selection acting within each cell, and then within each tissue, and within each organism, and then extra-organismally as well. Okay, so that's the end of this video on natural selection. Thanks very much, and I will talk to you later.